I'm Ryan O'Doud, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we're continuing with section 11.6 in the Russian Cosmists, the Esoteric Futurism of Nikolai Fedderov and His Followers by George Young. We're picking up at the beginning of chapter 6. Nikolai Fedorovich Fedorov, 1829 to 1903, the philosopher of the common task. Now there's a saintly man, said Lev Nikolaevich. He owns nothing. Any book that he buys or that is given him, he at once donates to the library. At home he sleeps on a trunk on newspapers, in a tiny little room he rents from some old woman. He is, of course, a vegetarian, but is bashful and doesn't like to talk about it. But do you know, he has his own theory. And Tolstoy began to tell us something strange. Fedorov can in no way reconcile himself with the thought that men are dying, and that people now, very dear to us, will vanish without a trace. And he has developed a theory that science, by a giant step forward, will discover a means to extract from the earth the remains, the particles, of our forefathers, in order then to restore them again to living form. Note from the notebook of V.F. Lazursky, July 13th, 1894. Throughout his life and for much of the century after his death, Fedorov was all but unknown. Since the end of the Soviet period, however, he has become, at least in his own country, one of the best-known figures in the history of Russian thought. While probably only a few very serious students have read through much of his work, everyone who knows anything about Russian intellectual history knows one very important thing about this eccentric, once obscure Moscow librarian. The one idea. Like the hedgehog in the well-known dichotomy, which Sir Isaiah Berlin borrows from a fragment attributed to Archaeologus, between foxes, who know many things, and hedgehogs, who know one big thing, Nikolai Fedorov was a thinker with one vast idea. He believed that all known problems have a single root in the problem of death, and that no solution to any social, economic, political, or philosophical problems will prove adequate until we have solved the problem of death. But if a solution to the problem of death can be found, then solutions to any and all other problems will follow. All of his writings, collected under the title Philosophia obscego dela, translated The Philosophy of the Common Task, are devoted to a solution to the problem of death. He believed that any question, no matter how apparently trivial, is under the surface literally a question of life and death, a consideration of the development of handwriting, of female attire, or of the entire history of the human race will lead to one and the same conclusion, that disintegration is the universal rule and that reintegration is the human task. No matter where Fedorov looks, he sees manifestations of the natural principle of disintegration and death, and yet with unfailing optimism he views every instance of disintegration as a fresh opportunity for us to begin the common task of reintegration. All philosophies, Fedorov wrote, while disagreeing about all else, agree on one thing. They all recognize the reality of death, its inevitability, even when recognizing, as some do, nothing real in the world. The most skeptical systems, doubting even doubt itself, bow down before the fact of the reality of death. Fedorov then would establish his position against the entire history of philosophy, arguing that death is not an inevitable certainty, but conditional. Death is a property, a condition, but not a quality without which man ceases to be what he is and what he ought to be. To Fedorov, man as he ought to be is not only himself immortal, but engaged in the task of bringing immortality to all others. Fedorov speaks of two kinds of death. The one he devotes most attention to is death as disintegration, whether in the physical universe, in society, in the family, or within the individual. Particle is separated from particle. The inner ties dissolve. The whole is shattered. The task of all humanity is to restore to wholeness and life all that nature would disaggregate and drive to death. The opposite of disintegration, in the world as it presently exists, is not wholeness but fusion. This also is a kind of death, in which each unit loses its individuality and particularity, and all discrete parts are amalgamated into a lifeless mass. Fedorov finds death by fusion, like death by disintegration, present everywhere, in mass movements, in blind allegiance to the war cry, and in the swallowing of the lives of individual villages by cities. The task here is to decentralize, to turn the lifeless, shapeless mass back into living units. The world as it is operates under the principles of disintegration and fusion. Everything is either disaggregated into unconnected particles or amalgamated into huge lifeless corporate entities. Editor's note. K.O. Ordo. The common task is to reverse the natural flow of life towards death, as disintegration and death as fusion, and to restore everywhere a wholeness that ensures both the integrity of the unit and the unity of the whole. The model or icon for the universe as it should be is the mystical consubstantiality of the Holy Trinity. In the words of the Orthodox liturgy, ni sliano, ni razdelno, neither fused nor disaggregated, perfect as both three and one. In today's terms, Fedorov's project might be described as an attempt to turn the universe of the Big Bang into one of a steady state. In Fedorov's utopia, which he did not consider utopia, but simply the world, quote, as it ought to be, there will be neither birth nor death, but a gradual restoration of life to all, literally all, who have ever lived. The life and unity of all humankind must include those now dead. To stop the task of unification, after only the living have been united and freed from death, would be, Fedorov insists, an act of selfishness and immaturity. Maturity and morality require that sons and daughters not only take life from their parents, but return it. The duty of resurrecting unites both memento mori as a most lamentable fact and momenti vivere as a necessary, inevitable goal. By uniting all people alive in a task to overcome the only true enemy of all people alive, namely death, the project of literal active physical resurrection would represent a great step forward toward the solution of many other problems which seem insoluble today. Energies and resources now directed toward war would be directed toward resurrection. Historical enemies would find mutual assistance not only possible but necessary. Unbelievers who in theory might find Christianity unacceptable would, by resurrecting the dead, become in practice followers of Christ. The resurrection of the dead would be a long and gradual but ultimately universal project. The philosopher Vladimir Solovyov once estimated to Fedorov that it might take several thousand years. But as Fedorov explains, quote, the difficulty for each generation of restoring the generation that immediately preceded it will be absolutely equal. For the attitude of the present generation toward its fathers, and of that generation which will first acquire the art of restoration toward its fathers, is exactly the same as the attitude of our great-grandfathers towards their fathers. Although the first resurrectee will be in all likelihood resurrected almost immediately after death, hardly ever even having died, and after him will follow those in whom very little decomposition is evident. Nevertheless, each new experience in this task will make subsequent steps easier. With each new person resurrected, knowledge will be growing. It will peak in its task just when the human race arrives at the first person who died. Moreover, for our great-great-grandchildren, it will be incomparably more difficult to resurrect their fathers than for us and for our great-great-grandfathers. For in the resurrection of our fathers, we shall make use not only of all previous experiences in the task, but shall even have the collaboration of our resurrectors. In this way it will be the easiest of all for the first Son of Man to resurrect his father, the Father of all people." End quote. Thus, the first steps might consist of little more than the brief temporary resuscitation of a person who had just died. But as all scientific technology, socio-political organization, indeed all human knowledge and action, gradually become directed towards the goal of resurrection, more than brief and temporary resuscitation would in time be possible. Eventually, the synthesizing of bodies should be possible, and ultimately, Fedorov believed, whole persons could be recreated from the least trace of recovered ancestral dust. To recover particles of disintegrated ancestors, Fedorov projected, research teams would have to travel to the moon, to the planets, and to distant points throughout the universe. Eventually, these outer points of the cosmos would be colonized by the resurrected ancestors, whose bodies might be re-engineered so that they could live under conditions that could not now support human life as it is known. This would both extend the realm of spirituality and rationality to areas of the universe now presumed to be lifeless, and solve the Malthusian problem of the overpopulated Earth. Space exploration, thus, should not be undertaken simply for itself, out of curiosity, or as an adventure or conquest, but for a specific purpose, life over death for all humanity. We shall discuss some of the details of Fedorov's project in greater depth further along in this study. For now, it is perhaps sufficient to say that while Fedorov may be considered a thinker with one idea, his single idea was extremely complex and comprehensive. He includes any number of individual projects within his one grand project of resurrection. Some of these subsidiary projects, such as the gathering of all nations into one political unit governed by a Russian autocrat, constitute in themselves vast and complex, not to mention improbable, undertakings. Other projects, such as the establishing of small local museums, are more realizable and less grandiose in scale. But an important point to be made, even from the start, is that all Fedorov's projects are interrelated. All are directed towards the ultimate goal of resurrecting the dead. And in Fedorov's mind, at least, all are necessary in order for any to succeed. The scientific projects cannot be understood in isolation from the religious, political, sociological, artistic, and economic projects. In contrast to some of his followers, Fedorov repeatedly emphasizes that technological advance, if pursued independently from advances in morality, the arts, government, and spirituality, and if pursued for its own sake, or for purposes other than the resurrection of the ancestors, could end only in disaster. And further, also in contrast to some of the other cosmist thinkers, he believed that spiritual development alone, without scientific technology, could also lead only to a dead end. Many thinkers before and after Fedorov have proposed one or more of the ideas that Fedorov puts forward, but only Fedorov rolls them all into hedgehog-like unity. Fedorov was convinced that his project was practical and realizable. To the objection that all human knowledge and effort could never be directed towards a single goal, he simply said, look around. At the present time, everything serves war. There is not one discovery which the military does not study with the aim of applying it to warfare, not one invention which they do not attempt to turn to military use. A world order and economy pointed towards a single goal already exists. All we have to do is change our present orientation and goal. One of his favorite examples, repeated several times in the thousands of pages of his writings, is of American experiments to bring rain in time of drought by shooting cannons into the air. A simple reorientation of aim from horizontal to vertical, from weapons of destruction to instruments of salvation. And this simple but radical change in orientation, from horizontal to vertical, returns throughout his writings to symbolize the reorientation needed in every field of activity, from a horizontal zoomorphic culture of human animals to a vertical, fully human stance of broad rational perspective, from a Ptolemaic earth-centered worldview to Copernican, cosmos-centered worldview. from the horizontal position of a body lying in its grave to the vertical position of the monument and mourner standing over that grave, from the horizontality of the railroad track to the verticality of the air balloon now and the spaceship tomorrow. He insisted that his projects were in no way utopian fantasies, but reasonable, necessary, practical, feasible tasks. He does not himself claim to know how, for instance, future biologists will create synthetic bodies. But he does insist that if future biologists take the creation of synthetic bodies as their task, as they should, they can and will find the solution. Fedorov believes that humanity's creative potential is unlimited. In the long run, people can accomplish whatever they set out to accomplish, whether a better way to exterminate or to preserve, extend, and restore all human life. In the course of his writings, Fedorov points out hundreds of different ways in which we are now at work on our own destruction, and argues that in each case, the only way that we can not destroy ourselves is by radically transforming our goal of conscious and unconscious self-annihilation into the goal of conscious self-perfection. And the only way to do this, urgently and immediately, to switch our orientation in every way from horizontal to vertical, to stop doing whatever we are now doing, and to begin the attempt to resurrect the dead. The Unacknowledged Prince. From the first obituaries to the most recent full biography, a phrase often used to characterize Fedorov is Makovsky Sokrat, the Moscow Socrates. And in many ways, Fedorov did lead a Socratic life, indifferent to status and comfort, preferring oral to written transmission of his ideas, relying on friends and disciples to propagate his teachings, using his place of work in the library as a teaching space, in the way that Socrates used the Athenian agora. But the difference is the way they taught is crucial. The difference in the way they taught is crucial. We can recall that toward the end of his apology, Socrates argues that death is not to be feared, that we do not know what death is, and therefore to fear death is a form of hubris, to pretend that we know what we do not know. For all we know, perhaps death is even a good thing. His last words in court are, "The hour of departure has arrived, and we go our ways. I to die, and you to live. Which is better, God only knows." In Fedorov, we definitely do know what death is, and it is not good. As we shall see, the awareness of death, the one enemy of all humankind, enters into his earliest memories. Fedorov was born May 26, 1829, in the village of Klyuchi, in the Tambov province in the south of Russia, the illegitimate son of Prince Pavel Ivanovich Gagarin, who was a black sheep from one of Russia's oldest and most illustrious families. Fedorov's mother was Elizaveta Ivanova, a local woman about whom very little is presently known. From Fedorov's friend and follower Vladimir Kazevnikov, again I apologize for my butchering the Russian names, the religious philosopher Pavel Florensky learned a few details about the family which he wrote down in a short biographical note about Fedorov. He was the son of Prince Pavel Gagarin. But just what kind of person this Pavel Gagarin was, it hasn't been possible to make out. Fedorov's mother had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. At first it was thought that she was a peasant, but later it turned out that she was the daughter of a minor official, something like a collegiate register clerk. At first she lived with Gagarin, but when Pavel's father, the old Gagarin, decided to marry off his son, they took the children away from her, surreptitiously loaded them in a coach, and took them off to one of the other family estates. Fedorov remembered how she ran after the coach and cried. Fedorov rarely visited his mother. They weren't on good terms, but he evidently loved his father and spoke well of him. That's all that Vladimir Alexandrovich Kozevnikov told me. Along with these details, Florensky offers a key insight into Fedorov's philosophical work. It's not difficult to understand what a deep connection this past of Nikolai Fedorovich has with his philosophical family, where there are a father, brothers and sisters, but no mother, where the earthly has such a specific aroma, where the feminine principle is so degraded. As many commentators have noted, Fedorov's thought is extremely patriarchal. He emphasizes rigor, duty, task, abstention, the responsibility of sons toward fathers, and rails against the eternal temptress, the desire for trivial consumer goods, the feminine ideals of worldly pleasure and comfort. Whether due to early memories of his own mother, as Florensky suggested, or to other reasons, unlike many Russian writers and thinkers, Fedorov in all his writings honors the archetypical great father, lord of the four corners, rather than the magna mater. As was the custom of the time for illegitimate children, Fedorov was given his surname in patronymic, Fedorovich Fedorov, from the godfather at his christening. From Fedorov's father, the distinguished Gagarin line had been traced back as far as Ryorik, the legendary founder of Russia. As noted above, Fedorov's grandfather, Ivan Alexeyevich Gagarin, was a leading dignitary and Freemason from the late 18th century through the period of the Napoleonic Wars. He could have been one of the pillars of a lodge very much like the one Pierre Bezukhov is initiated into in War and Peace. Ivan Alexeyevich's second wife was the noted actress Katerina Smirnova, considered by Pushkin to have been the greatest tragic actress of her time. Through marriage, the Gagarin family was related to the Kropotkin family, and thus Fedorov was the unacknowledged second cousin of the famous anarchist P.A. Kropotkin. Another closer relative of Fedorov's was Ivan Sergeyevich Gagarin, a leading Slavophile of the 1830s and 1840s, who later converted to Roman Catholicism. Of the Gagarin family in general, Kropotkin once wrote it was after the infusion of Gagarin blood that the Kropotkin family first began to display literary talent and social concern. Among Fedorov's papers, the editors of his posthumous works found only one torn sheet of autobiographical material. It reads, "From the years of childhood, 3 memories remain clear to me. I saw black, very black bread, on which I heard people say the peasants fed in what was probably some year of famine. From childhood I heard an explanation of war, to my question about it, that put me into terrible confusion. In war people shoot each other. And finally, I learned that some people are not one's kin, but strangers, and even among one's kin, some are not kin, but strangers." These 3 memories, recalled near the end of a long life of activity and thought, point to 3 of Fedorov's abiding concerns: the problems of hunger, war, and the absence of feelings of kinship, rodstvo, among people. His project of resurrection would eventually include proposals that people regulate nature to provide adequate but not excessive harvests in order to end hunger, that implements of war be turned into instruments of salvation, and that Christianity become a project of universal sonship and kinship, and a labor to restore life to the ancestors. The memory that even among one's kin some are not kin but strangers is Fedorov's only recorded reference to his own illegitimate birth. But Fedorov's entire work can in part be understood as an attempt to deal on a universal scale with a problem that he first had to confront when he became fully aware of the circumstances of his birth. In a sense, Fedorov views all people as illegitimate children, the issue not of true Christ-like love, but of blind natural force, offspring who have no true knowledge of even their mortal fathers, much less the divine Father, brothers and sisters unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that they are of one family. And although Fedorov never used the word illegitimate, the role that he always assumes for himself in his writings is that of the outsider looking in, the unlearned man addressing an audience of the learned, the practical, down-to-earth working man talking to philosophers. As a nobleman without a title, an educated man without a degree, and a teacher without an academic appointment, Fedorov was able to discuss learned questions from an unusual perspective. His ideas, he believed, were not particularly original, but were simply ideas that have long been common among the simple people. By giving these ideas philosophical expression, Fedorov was merely making them accessible to intellectuals. As an unlearned man addressing the learned, Fedorov insisted that he was not trying to create a new philosophy, but was merely pointing out problems of life and death, which those who lacked privilege and comfort could not afford to ignore. Fedorov's father, Prince Pavel Ivanovich Gagarin, followed what appear to have been artistic, perhaps bohemian inclinations, not living and working at the family estate, but founding and directing theatrical companies in Odessa, Kishinev, and various other towns and cities in the south of what was then Russia, now Ukraine and Moldova. Pavel Ivanovich's passion was not limited to the theater itself, but apparently extended also to a number of the actresses who graced his stages. The theatrical offerings, sometimes productions of high culture, like Shakespeare and Schiller, other times vaudeville and slapstick comedies, all delighted his audience, provided a steady flow of scandals for the newspapers, led Prince Pavel into bankruptcy, and estranged him from the rest of the Gagarin family. In addition to the 4 illegitimate children Prince Pavel Ivanovich fathered with Fedorov's mother, he later sired at least 4 more with another woman he did not marry, between which liaisons he fathered a legitimate family of 3 sons and 2 daughters with a lawful wife. Fedorov's much younger half-brother, from Pavel Ivanovich's second illegitimate family, has left a touching account of the prince's melancholy isolation after the collapse of his theaters, when he would stay up alone late at night improvising beautiful but sad airs on the violin. Pavel Ivanovich continued to love and admire his distinguished brothers despite their scornful treatment of him. Fedorov's half-brother tells us that he once sat with his father all afternoon outside their home waiting for one of Pavel Ivanovich's brothers, a distinguished government official, to ride by in an elegant carriage. At last the carriage did drive by, but the figure inside neither waved nor even glanced at his waiting brother and nephew. This event echoes Fedorov's scribbled memory, as even among one's kin some are not kin but strangers. Fedorov is known to have had at least 2 sisters, with whom he kept in contact over the years, a full brother, Alexander Fedorovich Fedorov, with whom he attended school as a boy and whose funeral he took rare time off from the library to attend, and the half-brother already mentioned, Alexander Pavlovich Lenski, who became one of the leading stars of the late 19th century Russian stage, and whose autobiography does not mention Fedorov, but provides a valuable account of a boyhood in the Gagarin household that must have been similar to the boyhood Fedorov had known 20 years earlier. Throughout his life, Fedorov kept in touch with and sometimes visited his half-sisters from his father's legitimate family. On those visits, he was always addressed as Nikolai Pavlovich rather than Nikolai Fedorov. N.P. Peterson, a friend and disciple who accompanied Fedorov on one of those visits, was too inhibited at the time to inquire about Fedorov's relationship to these aristocrats, or why they called him Nikolai Pavlovich. In the absence of Fedorov's father, an uncle, Konstantin Ivanovich Gagarin, assumed responsibility for the estate after the death of Fedorov's grandfather in 1832, and he generously provided for Fedorov's schooling, first at the Tambov Gymnasium, from which he graduated in 1848, and then at the Richelieu Lyceum, which for unknown reasons Fedorov left in 1854 without taking his degree. According to Peterson, Fedorov left the Lyceum just before graduation when, during an oral examination, he fell into a heated dispute with one of his instructors and refused to stand for further examination. Later, to a colleague at the Rumianetsev Museum, Fedorov mentioned that he had not obtained his degree because of an act of insubordination. But an additional reason was that Konstantin Ivanovich Gagarin, uncle and guardian to Fedorov and his brother, had died the year before, leaving no one to pay for the 2 boys' further education. Although he did not attend a university, Fedorov's education was a good one for a young man of the time. That he studied at the respected Richelieu Lyceum indicates that his uncle Constantine had provided him not only with the financial means but also the encouragement and confidence to pursue a sound education. That, in Peterson's version, Fedorov left in a huff before receiving his degree, may suggest that quite early in life he had acquired some of the stubbornness, self-assurance, and intellectual independence that characterized his later writings and that seems to have been traits of the Gagarin line. The Village Teacher. After the Lyceum, Fedorov began his years of wandering through southern and central Russia. From 1854 to 1868, he moved from one town or provincial village to another, serving as a teacher of elementary history and geography in such places as Lipetsk, Bogorodsk, Uglich, Odoiva, Bagoratitsk, Borovask, and Podolsk. As a teacher, Fedorov seems to have been loved by his pupils and regarded by his superiors as a nuisance and a crank. His later friend, editor, and biographer Vladimir Kozevnikov tells us that Fedorov's frequent removals were due to his unwillingness to limit his work to prescribed activities. Apparently, he caused constant friction by going beyond the duties officially assigned to teachers. In later years, Kozevnikov tells us, Fedorov's former pupils continued to seek his advice on major decisions and answers to questions that troubled them in life. Fedorov believed that a teacher should treat his pupils like sons, and that his role as teacher should not be to discipline pupils, but to set them working on joint projects of discovery. Believing that his entire family should take part in the children's education, Fedorov encouraged his pupils to tackle problems which could only be solved with help from home. One of the stories that Koznisnikov tells indicates the depths of Fedorov's love for his pupils. Like other provincial school teachers in Russia at the time, Fedorov received a salary that only a hermit could live well on. Nevertheless, Fedorov's greatest concern seems to have been not how to increase his income, but how to give the largest part of his meager salary away. Once when a pupil's father fell ill and could not pay for a doctor, Fedorov gave the boy all his money to defray the father's medical expenses. When the pupil's father died, Fedorov sold his only teacher's uniform and donated the proceeds to the orphan to pay for the burial. When Fedorov appeared in school without his uniform, wearing the shabby clothing that was the only other clothing he owned, a school inspector severely reprimanded him for having dared appear in class in a dress not befitting the station of teacher, and demanded an immediate explanation. Fedorov stubbornly refused to offer any explanation, and apparently indicated that he would rather resign than say a word in his own defense. Fortunately, on this occasion, the principal evidently learned the whole story and persuaded Fedorov not to resign. But from this incident, one can perhaps begin to understand why Fedorov seldom stayed at the school for more than 1 year. Documents recently uncovered by a Russian researcher further show how, in his first teaching job, Fedorov sorely irritated the headmaster of the village school at Lipetsk. In a formal complaint to the director of Tambov District Schools, the Lipetsk headmaster writes, For some time now, Mr. Fedorov, the teacher of geography and history at the school under my direction, has begun to display characteristics of impudence, willfulness, and insubordination, and more than once has directed insults not only at his comrades, but also at people outside the school. The complaints that have come to me concerning his crude and insubordinate conduct on more than one occasion have forced me to report on him, and in order to curtail these bad inclinations of his, I've employed every means to draw him into society, but all my efforts have turned out to be vain. Displaying a crude mentality, he looks down on everyone, and ignores decorum to such a degree that he even appears before me simply in galoshes, without boots, and through the entire past winter, heedless to my warnings, he wore a beard. Recently, he was so impudent as to start instructing other teachers on how to conduct their classes. He berated the Russian language teacher Stepanov for wishing to punish a pupil, and later on the 23rd of last May, not only berated but threatened to beat the teacher at another school, Erkov, for the sole reason that, following my instructions, he told the pupil that he could not dare come to school without proper clothing. For this offense, I had to issue him a severe reprimand. But he, after uttering some rude comments, at once ceased teaching the class and forthwith quit his post, to which to this day he has stubbornly refused to return. In presenting all this for your Excellency's consideration, I would make bold to submit that Mr. Fedorov, owing to the coarseness and impudence of his character, as well as to the nature of his thoughts, nourished by the harmful false doctrines of the West, equality, liberty, and the rejection of authority and absolute indifference toward official obligations, can no longer be tolerated in his present position. For he, dreaming about equality, encourages his pupils to make insubordinate demands. He pays no attention whatsoever to advice or direction. He stubbornly wears a beard, and dresses in such a slovenly manner that he even brings shame to his comrades. And he treats the teaching of his subject carelessly, like mechanical labor, just to earn a living. As a result, the pupils in history and geography are left in an unsatisfactory situation. As a green, supremely idealistic teacher, Fedorov could not have been an easy colleague to work with, much less supervise. But in his report to the district director, the headmaster of the Lipet school goes out of his way to disparage Fedorov. As we shall see from his friend Peterson's account of their first meeting, Fedorov's attitude towards the harmful false doctrines of equality, liberty, and other Western imports was not at all the attitude that the headmaster attributed to him. Indeed, as we see later, Fedorov's view towards quote-unquote progressive ideas was much more negative than the headmaster's. Fedorov's shabby dress was less a gesture of insubordination than an indifference to all external appearance. He wore a beard because he was extremely conservative and identified with the patriarchs of old, not because he was an unkempt radical from the Parisian barricades, eager to indoctrinate Lepensk 10-year-olds in revolutionary politics. And most important, as he explains in his response to the charges, his negative behavior towards his colleagues was in response to their mistreatment of both his and their pupils. Fedorov responded to the charges. As a result of your communication to me of August 7, I have the honor to offer you a brief explanation regarding the 4 points specified in your communication. 1. Concerning the inappropriate and impudent behavior during the class lessons of comrades Messrs. Stepanov and Erkov. In your report to the director of the Tambov district schools concerning my inappropriate behavior toward comrades, you doubtless forgot to mention the bad behavior of these same comrades toward pupils. It's difficult to be an indifferent observer of the kind of behavior that Mr. Stepanov and Erkov permit themselves towards the pupils. And I have not always managed to constrain myself within the limits of civility, and thus my involuntary displeasure came across as impudence. In order to ward off similar unpleasant situations, I have proposed to you, Mr. Headmaster, that you put into effect a resolution, the force of which would be to assign the right to establish punishment for students to the District Pedagogical Council, and not to the whim of every teacher. You, Mr. Headmaster, not only rejected my just demand, but even vowed to carry out the punishment of pupils yourself. After that, my further presence in the school could only serve to intensify the punishments. That is the reason for my voluntary termination of duties. The bad behavior of Mr. Stepanov and Erkov toward their pupils was so unpleasant and sad for me to observe that I consider the teaching of geography, and especially of history, in light of such behavior, to be absolutely impossible. If to this is also added the circumstances that in the entire district school there are only 16 pupils, very few of whom regularly attend class, and entire classrooms have been standing empty, then it should be clear whether under such conditions successful instruction in the subject I have been teaching is indeed even possible. But your expression, the pupils of all classes showed no successes whatsoever, forces me to doubt the accuracy of your investigations. As for the beard, I can only say that I actually wore it only 2 or 3 months after the course of the current year. Contrary to the charges brought against him, the later testimony of former students indicates that Fedorov was an exceptionally good teacher, always emphasizing practical applications of knowledge rather than simple memorization and accumulation of facts. As Kozhnikov noted, years after Fedorov had left teaching to work in the Moscow libraries, formal pupils continued to turn to him for advice, and as we shall see, whenever anyone came to him with a serious desire to learn, whether in school or in the library, Fedorov went to extraordinary lengths to encourage, assist, and if possible, properly direct that person's researches. The years that Fedorov spent as a village teacher were critical years in the life of Russia. The Crimean War, the emancipation of the serfs, the decline of village life and the growth of cities, and the emergence of a radical intelligentsia all combined to make this period one of the most controversial and decisive in the history of the country. The Russia that Fedorov knew during these years of enormous change was not the Russia of Moscow and Petersburg, but the Russia of Lipetsk, Bogorodsk, Oglik, and Podolsk. The people he knew and identified with were not those who were making decisions for all Russia, but those who had to live with whatever decisions were made. In the towns and villages where Fedorov lived, war meant peasants returning without arms or legs and families without fathers or sons. Emancipation too often simply meant being uprooted. Education meant learning to remove oneself from the common people and common life. He would later suggest that emancipation had been a great mistake, that instead of freeing the serfs, the Tsar should have serfed the free. And education, as currently practiced, produced only learned idlers. Future education should become universal active research into the causes and solutions to the problem of death. As noted before, Fedorov would later write that most serious and destructive division between people was not between rich and poor, but between the learned and unlearned. Those of the learned class, he argued, had separated themselves from the unlearned masses, from the soil, from their origins, from their fathers, and ultimately from nature, God, and life. The learned, who had the knowledge to control the blind, destructive forces of nature, did not feel the need to do so. Living in cities, insensible to nature's brute power, the learned viewed nature merely from an aesthetic standpoint. The unlearned, on the other hand, who knew and had to bear the brunt of nature's blind force every day, had the desire but lacked the knowledge to exercise control. To the learned, nature was a matter of beauty or ugliness. To the unlearned, a matter of life and death. The idea of nature as its purest, as wilderness for Fedorov, would always be the opposite of the romantic ideal, still common in America today, of pristine sacred space unspoiled by humans. In describing the Russian natural landscape, Fedorov writes that it is better for the soul that Russia had no spectacular scenery, no alpine grandeur or charming Italianate vistas to lull the Russian into complacency, to tempt him towards aesthetic delight, lead him to sublime repose, and distract him from his transformative task. In Fedorov, any form of nature worship is viewed essentially as a death wish. Moreover, by pursuing knowledge for its own sake and scorning all practical application of knowledge, Fedorov argued, the learned merely aided those who would wage war. The learned contribute to the waging of war either directly by discoveries which can be turned into weapons, or indirectly by allowing their discoveries to be turned into articles of commerce, which leads to competition, which then inevitably leads to war. The only solution was for the learned to form themselves into a temporary task force, whose assignment would be to find practical means to regulate nature. In the war against nature, all armies of the world would collaborate to liberate mankind from blind force, and all military weapons would be turned into instruments for the benefit of humanity, just as in war. People shoot each other, so in the task of regulation, people would shoot their cannons not at each other, but at the natural forces they wish to control. This simple but radical shift in direction seemed to Fedorov the first step toward the solution of the problems of how to turn mankind from self-destruction. By shifting the orientation from horizontal to vertical, initially in the aiming of cannons and later in other redirections of effort, man could begin the task of his own resurrection. First disciple, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. In the early 1860s, a book that all Russian intellectuals were talking about was Chernyshevsky's long, turgid, didactic novel, What Is to Be Done. In his hero, Rakhmetov, and his heroine, Vera, Chernyshevsky attempted to create positive models to be emulated by Russian youth. In deliberate contrast to the line of attractive, talented, but ineffectual, superfluous men notorious to all students of Russian literature, Rakhmetov is an upright, faultless, unwavering new man, selflessly dedicated to his cause, the establishing of utopian communes, and the eventual revolutionary transformation of Russian society. Vera, the model for the new Russian woman, launches as her part in the transformation of Russia a sewing cooperative in which three young girls gradually become aware of the benefits of communal life and labor. This book and the writings of Chernyshevsky's two younger fellow nihilists, Nikolai Dobrolyubov and Dmitry Pisarev, had an enormous impact on the student generation of the 1860s. Living in tiny, filthy, book-cluttered rooms, underlining pages of Mill, Comte, Darwin, and Buchner's Kraft and Tolstoy, calling themselves socialists, scientists, determinists, nihilists, or simply new people. Thousands of sometimes students all over Russia were discussing, planning, and sporadically attempting to take actual steps toward the radical transformation of Russia into a vaguely socialist, materialist, utopian society. Some of these young revolutionaries and would-be revolutionaries met in more or less secret groups to discuss ideas, exchange literature, and lay plans for future action. Early in 1864, one such ex-student, Nikolai Pavlovich Peterson, then 20 years old and a member of a Moscow-based group which would later be known as the Organization, came to Bogorovsk ostensibly to teach mathematics, but chiefly to spread revolutionary propaganda. He writes, "One of my fellow members in the circle informed me that in Bogorovsk there was a teacher at the district school, a certain Nikolai Fedorov, a selfless man who by his life reminded one of Rakhmitov, a man of unusual intelligence and honesty, and at that time we thought that an intelligent and honest man could not help but be on our side. And so arriving in Bogorodsk on March 15th, 1864, I went at once to see Nikolai Fedorovich, who turned out to be a man about 40 years old, i.e. about 4 years older than Lev Nikolaevich. He was a bachelor and lived as an ascetic. He not only did without a bed, but without even a pillow. He ate whatever his landlord's simple merchants put out for him, the healthful but simple dish food that they themselves ate. During Lent, NF ate Lenten dishes, and on Wednesdays, Fridays, and other days of fasting, he fasted. NF never made any special demands and was always content with whatever he was given. In my first meeting with NF, I immediately blurted out everything about myself and explained the purpose for which I had become a teacher at the district school. To this, NF said, 'I don't understand what you're troubling yourself about. After all, you won't be able to give those for whom you're troubling yourself anything except material well-being, since you don't admit to any other well-being. But meanwhile, working to obtain material well-being for others, you renounce it for yourself, and indeed are prepared even to sacrifice your life for the sake of this. But what if material well-being is no more important to those for whom you're troubling yourself than it is to you? To what end is all your bother?' In the course of our conversation, I heard from NF that the so-called great principles of the great French Revolution, freedom, equality, and brotherhood, are the product of extremely shallow thought or even thoughtlessness, since brotherhood cannot result from freedom to fulfill one's whims, or from the envious desire for equality. Only brotherhood leads to freedom, for brothers who love one another will not envy one brother who is elevated above others, and will not try to lower him to their own level, and the brother who has raised himself above the others will try to bring all his brothers up to his level. For that reason we must seek brotherhood first, and not put it at the tail after freedom and equality, as did the proponents of freedom, equality, and brotherhood. We must seek brotherhood first, and the rest will follow. But there cannot be brotherhood without fatherhood in a fatherland, for only by fathers are we brothers, and therefore filial and paternal love must be placed at the head, and from this fraternal love will issue. Conversing in this manner, NF gradually unfolded an entire world outlook, which was perfectly new to me, and which called for the unification of all people in a labor of universal resurrection. I was committed at once, and already forever. Nikolai Fedorovich did not stay long in Borodsk while I was there. No more than about 3 months, but these 3 months enriched me more than my entire life had before, and gave me a firm base for the remainder of my life. A young revolutionary thus became Fedorov's first disciple. But 2 years later, in 1866, Fedorov's association with this young disciple led to his arrest in connection with the student Dmitry Karakozov's unsuccessful attempt to assassinate Tsar Alexander II. Peterson, before meeting Fedorov, had belonged to the same revolutionary circle as Karakozov, and shortly after the attempted assassination, Peterson, Fedorov, and a handful of Karakozov's other associates were brought in for questioning. During the interrogation, Peterson and the other young revolutionaries all testified that Fedorov had met with them, but that in those meetings the older man had argued strenuously against their convictions and had tried in every way possible to convince them to give up their revolutionary activities. As a result, all charges against Fedorov were dismissed, and he was quickly freed. Karakasov was hanged. The other conspirators received prison sentences of varying length, Peterson's being 6 months. As Peterson's Bogorodsk account indicates, and as the testimony of the Karakasov circle confirms, Fedorov had already worked out the main lines of his entire project by 1864. Indeed, in an article about Tolstoy from 1892, Fedorov writes that the idea of active resurrection awakened in him in 1851 when he was still at the Lyceum, but he may not have been begun to develop his ideas in writing until Peterson joined him as amanuensis and began to take down Fedorov's dictation. Although work kept them apart for most of the year, Fedorov and Peterson would meet on vacations and during the summers, and it was during these periods over many years that Fedorov's ideas were committed to writing. As Peterson acknowledges, it was he who first brought Fedorov's ideas to the attention of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. It was in 1876, in his capacity as editor of the journal Diary of a Writer, that Dostoevsky first received a manuscript from Peterson. For years, Peterson had been trying without success to persuade Fedorov to submit some of his dedicated writings for publication. Finally, without Fedorov's knowledge, Peterson decided to take matters into his own hands, and early in 1876 he sent Dostoevsky a manuscript of his own that contained a number of ideas that he could only have gotten from Fedorov. In the March 1876 issue of Diary of a Writer, Dostoevsky, without mentioning Peterson's name, published some extracts from the manuscript and ordered comments to the effect that he found the ideas interesting but isolated, and in fact, although the unnamed author advocates a genuine communion among men, the author's thoughts were examples of the very isolation and chemical decomposition of our society into its component parts that both Dostoevsky and the unnamed author abhorred. Dostoevsky then found the manuscript to be symptomatic of the very condition it purported to diagnose. A year later, when he received another manuscript from Peterson, this one containing a more detailed account of Fedorov's ideas, Dostoevsky sent a much different response. Quote, "The first matter is a question. Who is this thinker whose thoughts you have sent me? If possible, let me know his real name. He has aroused my interest more than enough. By all means, do tell me something more detailed about him as a person. All this, if you can. Let me tell you that essentially I am in complete agreement with these ideas. I have read them as if they were my own. Today I read them anonymously to Vladimir Sergeyevich Solovyov, and again I apologize for these Russian pronunciations. Our young philosopher who is now delivering lectures on religion, lectures that nearly 1,000 attend. I waited for him on purpose to read him your account of your thinker's ideas, since I found in his view much that is similar. We spent a beautiful 2 hours at this. He finds your thinker's ideas much to his liking, and had wished to say almost the same things in his next lecture. Of 12 lectures, he still has 4 to give. But now I have a friendly if difficult question, one that I've wanted to put to you since December. In your account of this thinker, the most essential thing, without a doubt, is the duty to resurrect the ancestors who lived before. If this duty were fulfilled, then childbirth would cease, and what the Gospels and the book of Revelation have designated as the first resurrection would begin. But what you have not stated at all in your account is just how you understand this resurrection of ancestors, in just what form you envision and believe in it. That is, do you understand it somehow mentally or allegorically, like, for example, Renan, who understands it to be something like a total illumination of human consciousness at the end of the life of mankind? An illumination of such intensity that it will be clear to the mind of those future people how great was, for example, one of the ancestors' influence on mankind, how and in what manner his influence was exerted, and so forth, and of such intensity that the role of every person who lived before will be seen with perfect clarity. His contribution will be divined. So intense that we shall even recognize that influence that all those who have lived before us have exerted on us, and the extent to which they are reincarnated in us? And will all this come to pass among those last people who will know everything and be in utter harmony, those last people in whom humanity will reach its conclusion? Or does your thinker intend this to be taken directly and literally, as religion implies, and that the resurrection will be real, that the abyss that divides us from the spirits of our ancestors will be vanquished by vanquished death, and that the dead will be resurrected not only in our minds, but not allegorically, but in fact in person, actually in bodies? Not, of course, in their present bodies, for when immortality begins, marriage and the birth of the children will end, and that alone is testimony that in the first resurrection, designated to be on earth, the bodies will perhaps be like Christ's body in the 50 days between his resurrection and ascension. An answer to this question is essential. Otherwise, it will be impossible to understand. I warn you that we here, that is, Solovyov and I at least, believe in a real, literal, personal resurrection, and one that will come to pass on earth. Do let me know, then, if you can and will, esteemed NP, what your thinker thinks about this, and if possible, let me know in more detail. Fedorov would later sharply attack both Dostoevsky and Solovyov for having envisioned a mystical, esoteric, occult form of resurrection accessible only to initiates and adepts. But his first reaction on reading this extraordinary letter was to begin to prepare what Fedorov and Peterson hoped would be a clear and adequate response to the great writer's questions. They worked at it off and on over the next 2 years, resulting eventually in the first and longest essay published in the first volume of Fedorov's posthumously collected works entitled The Question of Brotherhood, or Kinship, of the Reasons for the Unbrotherly, Unkindred, i.e. unpeaceful state of the world, and of the Means for the Restoration of Kinship. A note from the unlearned to the learned, clergy and laity, believers and unbelievers. But before the manuscript was sufficiently finished to send it off, Dostoevsky had died. As many scholars have noted, Fedorov's ideas are clearly reflected in the brothers Karamazov. As I have argued elsewhere, Dostoevsky had read many of the same books and shared many ideas, and even without Fedorov's manuscript, Dostoevsky was keenly aware of the complex nature of father-son competition. Fedorov's contribution probably was to clarify and point out the consequences of some of the thoughts that Dostoevsky had not thought through to the end. Fedorov may not have formulated his idea as brilliantly or as dramatically as Dostoevsky did, but the manuscript that Peterson sent was probably behind Ivan's question, who does not desire the death of his father? And Fedorov's arguments that we are all guilty of patricide probably helped Dostoevsky see that all four brothers, even saintly Alyosha, were to one degree or another responsible for the death of Fyodor Karamazov. Although Dostoevsky never did meet or even learn the name of the author of the ideas he had read as if they were my own, the manuscript prepared as an idea to Dostoevsky's question served to introduce both Fedorov and his idea to Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, as Peterson tells it. Quote, I cannot but relate here that in the summer of 1878, Nikolai Fedorov spent only 2 weeks at my house. In the same summer, I came to see him in Moscow, and on the Serzian-Moransk Railroad, on the half between Penza and Moroshansk, I met L.N. Tolstoy. He was returning with all his family from the Samara estate to Yasnaya Polyana, and I rode with him as far as Ryazk. On the way, I told him about Nikolai Fedorov and my communications with Dostoevsky. I read him Dostoevsky's letter, and what I had written from Nikolai Fedorov's dictation in reply to that letter during the 2 weeks that Nikolai Fedorov had just spent with me. And he had heard me through. Lev Nikolaevich told me that he didn't like the idea. Nevertheless, that same autumn, Lev Nikolaevich went to see Nikolai Fedorov at the museum and told him that he knew me, and that from that time began their acquaintanceship. Dostoevsky and Solovyev were attracted to Fedorov's ideas before they knew anything at all about the man. But Tolstoy, characteristically, had to find out what kind of life Fedorov lived before becoming interested in his ideas. And even after he had long known both Fedorov and his thought, Tolstoy remained more impressed by the idea that Fedorov slept on a humpback trunk than by the entire project of universal resurrection. Though the decade of the 1880s and into the early 1890s, Tolstoy and Fedorov met many times, and Tolstoy frequently refers to him in his letters and notebooks. For Tolstoy, these were years of spiritual unrest. Never a complacent person unaware of his own self-development, Tolstoy in the late 1870s and early 1880s was passing through a stage of especially intense spiritual torment and particularly ruthless self-examination. His earlier religious faith, never terribly strong, had collapsed utterly, and he was seeking a new faith to live by. That he could not live by a life strictly consistent with his deeply felt and widely publicized principles had always troubled him, and now tormented him. He had turned against the ideal of family life that he had so memorably depicted in War and Peace, but he still lived as, and at times very much enjoyed being, a family man. Theoretically, he had turned against his own social class, and against all art that did not illustrate some simple moral truth. And yet his biographers gave us a charming picture of Tolstoy at age 50, and his old aesthetic and ideological enemy, Turgenev, age 60, sitting at opposite ends of a child's teeter-totter, seesawing up and down as children from the neighborhood laugh and applaud. Even during his famous peasant phase, in which he allowed himself to be portrayed by the artist Repin à la Moujik behind a plow, we learn from his wife's diary that under his peasant smock he always wore silk underwear. In the early 1880s, then, Tolstoy was searching for, among other things, a person whose life was in full accordance with whatever principles he espoused, and chief among those who, in Tolstoy's judgment, passed that test was Fedorov. Eyewitnesses to their meetings described Tolstoy's unusual deference towards Fedorov, as if he viewed Fedorov as his moral superior, and in his behavior with Fedorov sometimes acted more like a son in the presence of a stern father than like a contemporary and equal. Professor I.A. Lenyashenko, who observed the two together many times, tells us that Tolstoy not only highly valued NF's moral qualities, he even openly bowed down before him, seeing in him one of the best personifications of his theory about loving what is closest hand and living life simply. The director of the Tretyakov Gallery, Chernogub, tells us that he once heard Tolstoy say, "If I didn't have my own teaching, I would become a follower of Nikolai Fedorov's teaching." The deference, however, was not reciprocal. People who often observed them talking together tell us that when Fedorov spoke, Tolstoy would listen respectfully and nod his agreement. But when Tolstoy spoke, Fedorov would usually scowl sternly and shake his head in strong objection. Fedorov was apparently one of the few people who dared tell Tolstoy to his face that he was an utter fool. N.N. Gusev relates that once while walking with Fedorov through the library stacks, Tolstoy looked at the books piled everywhere and remarked, "Ech, they ought to dynamite here." Fedorov apparently never forgave him for this remark. In another version of what may have been the same incident, Tolstoy said, "So many stupid things are written, it all ought to be burned." Fedorov, as if stung, seized him by the head. "I've seen many stupid men in the world, but never one like you." The witness reports that the author of War and Peace looked shocked, embarrassed, and confused. And once, when they were arguing some philosophical point, Tolstoy began to refer to something he had written earlier on the matter under discussion. Fedorov replied, "Very well, but at that time you, Lev Nikolaevich, were not only a distinguished writer, you were an intelligent person as well." Fedorov's objections to Tolstoy's late-period writings were chiefly that Tolstoy loved death, and that whilst claiming to offer a simpler, truer form of Christianity, he was actually preaching Neo-Buddhism. Tolstoy's doctrine of non-resistance was, to Fedorov, a total capitulation to the forces of nature, disintegration, and death. As Tolstoy himself told a young listener who began to smile as Tolstoy explained Fedorov's theory, "Yes, if you had tried to smile in his presence, he would have let you have it. Once I happened to catch sight of a little book in the Rumyantsev Museum, a list of kernels for some certain number of years, and I smiled. Did he scold me? All this is needed. All these are reminiscences of our ancestors. Now he can't abide by me. In the first place, because I don't share his theory. In the second place, because I love death. The Moscow Librarian. Beside Peterson's help in presenting Fedorov's ideas to his great contemporaries, it was also through Peterson that Fedorov became a librarian. Either because of conflicts with superiors, such as the ones described earlier, or because of personal wishes, Fedorov hardly ever taught for more than a year in the same school. Each year he petitioned his superiors to allow him a 10-day leave to come to Moscow, usually walking on foot, for the Easter season. And when he resigned from one teaching position to move on to another, the official reason given was usually on account of illness. In 1868, Fedorov quit his last teaching job and came to Moscow without specific plans for future employment. Peterson, who had been serving as librarian at the beautiful Chertkov Library, a wealthy collector's private institution devoted to collecting every known book related to Russia, had just accepted a position with the district court system and recommended Fedorov as his replacement in the library. It was the perfect position for Fedorov, who threw himself wholeheartedly into the work, and his services were immediately recognized and appreciated. In 1873, the entire Chertkov Library, and with it Fedorov, was absorbed into the larger Rumyantsev Museum. This institution, where Fedorov would work for the next 25 years, was Moscow's leading public library, and today forms a wing of the vast Russian state, formerly Lenin, library. In Fedorov's day, the library contained some 85,000 books and pamphlets, and some 18,000 broadsides, maps, and other unbound materials. Fedorov, in his capacity as cataloger and circulation desk, was reputed to know not only the location, but also the contents of every item in the library. Whenever a reader submitted a list of books to be brought from the stacks, he would often receive not only the items requested, but also several additional materials which the reader had never heard of, yet which would prove extremely useful, sometimes even essential, for his study. When the fortunate reader asked where the extra books had come from, he or she was told simply that Nikolai Fedderov had sent them. And sometimes, after receiving repeated extras from Nikolai Fedorov, the reader would be delivered an invitation to visit Fedorov in his office. Then it was said the reader's real education would begin. During his long life in Moscow, Fedorov lived alone, frequently changing addresses, but usually renting a small closet-sized room for around 6 rubles a month. He slept on a humpback trunk, sometimes bare, and sometimes covered with newspapers, placing under his head not a pillow but some hard object, usually a book. The only coat he wore every day, summer or winter, was more rag than coat, and strangers easily mistook him for a beggar on the streets. He had no furniture, and each time he moved to new quarters, he gave away whatever objects the room had accumulated. He spent nothing on entertainment, diversion, or any conveniences, and he refused to take cabs even in the coldest winter months. He drank only tea, ate hard rolls, sometimes accompanied by a piece of old cheese or saltfish, and lived for months without a hot meal. One of Fedorov's landlords asked visitors if Fedorov ate with them, for he had never taken the board that was included in the price for the rent of the room. Sometimes, almost by force, friends would settle him in decent, comfortable quarters, arrange with the landlord for a daily meal with at least 2 courses, and furnish the room with at least a bed and pillow. If the friends returned in a week, however, they would find that the room was again bare, that Fedorov had already given away the bed and pillow, and that at Fedorov's insistence the landlord would again be serving him only bread and tea. According to Kovnev, Fedorov had a fear of money and considered it poisonous, infectious, and vile. If he found any change in his pockets at night, he would curse himself for not having managed to give it away. He was obsessed with the fear that someday he might be found dead with 2 or 3 kopecks left in his pocket. Fedorov never married, and until recently he was not known to have had a romantic interest in any woman. But in researching archival materials, the Russian scholar Anastasia Gacheva discovered and published a surprising series of letters that Fedorov wrote to Ekaterina Stepanova Nekrasova, a young, pretty journalist. In most of these letters, Fedorov speaks only of books ordered or delivered, but in one, dated April 6, 1880, he expresses sentiments that give a very different picture from the stern, patriarchal misogynist that some commentators have made him out to be. I've written you, deeply and sincerely esteem Ekaterina Stepanova, at least 10 letters. You may see them if you wish, but could not make up my mind to send them. Now I shall say the same thing in 2 or 3 words, only take them literally, with all the force of their meaning. I shall say straight out, and I nourish toward your person a boundless, exclusive feeling of attraction. I am devoted to you with all my heart, all my mind, all my soul. Of all this, I hope, you will be convinced as soon as you change your anger to kindness, which I implore you to do. It is unbearably painful for me to see you unhappy, but even more painful not to see you at all. Sincerely devoted to you, Nikolai Fedderov. I'll keep hoping that you do not leave my letter unanswered. With all its arch dictation, this is as near a love letter as Fedorov would ever write. He was past 50. She was nearly 20 years younger. He knew that she regarded him as a wise and true friend, but he wished he could be more. What must have hurt Fedorov most was that the man Ekaterina Nekrasova preferred to him, but who did not return her love, was Gleb Yusensky, a writer of limited talent and scope, whose then extremely popular but now largely overlooked novels about the brutality of Russian peasant life reflect a shattered idealism and a bitter outlook on life. Nekrasova was hopelessly in love with Uspensky, and for some time they had an on-again, off-again relationship. But in 1885 she had to accept that their latest breakup would be final. After a series of literary successes alternating with failures, Uspensky spent his last years in a mental institution. And in 1902, at the age of 59, committed suicide. After Fedorov's letter of April 6, 1880, the only letters from him to her that have survived are the brief official messages on library matters. After Fedorov's death, Nekrasova wrote a warm obituary for one of the leading Moscow newspapers, in which she presented intimate details of his life and library work in Moscow, but made no mention of his philosophy or of any relationship other than that between a kind, considerate librarian and a grateful researcher. During Fedorov's last years, his daily working schedule, as chronicled by Nekrasova and many others, remained essentially the same as always. He would arrive at the library an hour or so before it opened, to make certain that books ordered late the previous day would be ready when the reader called. He would stay in the library after closing time to take care of any jobs that he had not been able to complete during business hours. He had no sympathy for those who were demanding an 8-hour workday, which he called 16-hour idleness. At home, he would have a light meal and talk with any friends who dropped by. He would sleep for 2 or 3 hours until about midnight. Then he would read and write until almost dawn. Then, after another short sleep of about 2 or 3 hours, he would set off for the library to start a new day. Last year's Ashgabat, the only portrait. In 1899, Peterson was transferred to the district court in Ashgabat, Turkestan, and in the summer of that year, Fedorov visited him to continue their long joint project of writing. This visit to Turkestan brought a new theme into Fedorov's thought and helped to open a new topic for thinkers who would come after him: the task of uniting East and West, Asia and Europe, the special continental Eurasian nature of Russia's historic mission. The question of Asia's future role in the world was the subject of much popular speculation at the time. In different ways and on different intellectual levels, Madame Blavatsky's theosophical writings proclaiming new wisdom from Asia, Vladimir Solovyov's apocalyptic visions of pan-Mongolism, and the journalists who wrote of the Yellow Peril all contribute to the fin de siècle assumption that in Russia as well as in Europe, that the time of Western dominance was coming to an end and a period of Asian supremacy was about to begin. But Fedorov took quite a different view. Turkestan, the vast territory both joining and separating Russia and China, a sparsely inhabited wasteland dominated by the Pamir Mountains and the surrounding desert, became in Fedorov's thought a major focal point for the task of regulating nature and resurrecting the dead. Formerly, Fedorov learned, the wasteland had been fertile and inhabited, and according to local legend was even the site of the original Eden. Only man's failure to regulate nature had permitted the former paradise to become an uninhabitable wasteland. Legend held that the bones of Adam, the father of all fathers, were buried somewhere in the desolate mountains, and as Fedorov once wrote to Kozevnikov, the landscape of the Pamir region reminded him of a pyramid of skulls. At that time, also, the Pamir region was thought to be one of the most likely candidates for the hypothetical homeland of the original Indo-European people. From here, the first fathers of all Indo-European language speakers had supposedly dispersed to what had become India, Persia, and Europe. In later times, the Pamir region had been the center from which the Mongol hordes had overrun Russia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Pamir then represented to Fedorov the world's center of repulsion. Adam and Eve, the Aryans, and the Mongols had all fled from the lost paradise. On either side of the Pamir region now lived representatives of the major races and religions of the world: Turan and Aryan, Buddhist, Hindu, Zoroastrian, Muslim, and Christian. Fedorov believed that it was more than political significance that in a recent treaty with England, Russia had gained control over the Pamir region. The duty of the Russian Tsar, as the one sitting in Pamir, the father place, and forefather place, Osto misto I Preotsov misto, would now be to start the restoration of Pamir by building, in the high, absolutely clear air of one of the peaks, an observatory for advanced research in astronomy, a first step towards regathering dispersed particles of ancestral dust and eventually establishing settlements beyond the Earth. He also proposed that Ashgabat become a site for international scientific research conferences, where specialists from all fields could collaborate as a special task force devoted to the restoration of life in the region, and eventually to all the dead. In the 1920s, the Eurasian movement of Russian immigrants would adopt Fedorov as a co-founder of their movement, and in the mid-20th century, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan would indeed become major centers for the astronomical and space industry activities that had been among Fedorov's signature ideas. It was during his visits to Peterson and Ashgabat that a detailed presentation of Fedorov's project first provoked a strong reaction from members of the general public. First Peterson, then Fedorov himself, published under various pseudonyms a series of articles in the local newspaper, Ashgabat, and while there was no immediate reaction to the first articles, as more items appeared, a lively polemic ensued. Between September 1899 and March 1903, at least 50 articles appeared presenting or reacting to Fedorov's ideas. In a typical sequence, Peterson, under the Nationalist NP, would write an article on a Fedorovian theme. Then a regular columnist named Serkunov would respond with qualified interest and sympathy. Another columnist who wrote under the name Pensoso would ridicule it mercilessly. Peterson would then write under a different pseudonym a defense of his initial NP article. Then two of the three writers could state their opinions, ranging from interested curiosity to puzzlement to outright disapproval. And then Fedorov himself would enter the polemic with a definitive clarification, a further exposition, and a defense of the idea, sometimes adding for good measure a sharp put-down of Mr. Pensoso. Then everyone would write back, and the polemic would enter another cycle. Of all the Ashgabat writers, only Peterson with his several pseudonyms fully endorsed Fedorov's project. Of the rest, even the most positive expressed serious reservations about the more radical sides of the project, and several simply found the whole idea preposterous. Probably the most important thing that Fedorov gained from the Ashgabat polemic was the sense that neither was his project ready for the world, nor was the world ready for his project. He had always been reluctant to publish his ideas, and this experience vindicated his reservations. Although he despised the notion of esotericism, Fedorov was now fated to become an unintentionally esoteric writer, whose ideas would be known to only a small coterie of friends and disciples, and when eventually published, would for many years find only a small, if devoted and highly influential readership. One of the ideas that Fedorov retained throughout life was that even the most menial and mundane job could become a sacred task. In the Chertkov Library and Rumyantsev Museum, he often said that behind the book a man is hidden, and treated even the most trivial assignments as opportunities to resurrect dead knowledge. In his last position as desk clerk in the Hall of the Archives for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which he assumed after retiring from the Rumyantsev Museum, he transformed his actual humble duties into a project for discovering and preserving documents pertaining to present worldwide disunity and future Russian-directed worldwide unity. In the records of Russia's foreign relations, he found innumerable confirmations of his conviction that Russia had a special destiny in the world. His late writings show that he had done considerable research on the historical meaning of the title Tsar, derived from Caesar, and that he had looked carefully at the wording of treaties under which Russia had acquired new territories. He found essentially that Russia's territorial growth had resulted from a series of acts that had both sacred and worldly, both hidden and open, significance. The Russian Tsar was divinely intended to be the father of all living peoples, and to represent the interests of the dead among the living. The true task of the Tsar was to gather all lands into one land, and to make all peoples one people. Building on the medieval doctrine of Moscow, the Third Rome, Fedorov was convinced that in the archives of the Foreign Affairs Ministry lay documents of paramount importance for the history of mankind. Russia's history was the world's history, dividing all in history as fact, uniting all in history as project. In letters to his friend Vladimir Kozhevnikov, written during the last 5 years of his life, Fedorov often expressed doubt that his lifelong project would find immediate acceptance and recognition. I have no hope that in our age of unthought and inaction, the problem of the universal task of the regulation of nature by human reason and will can possibly attract attention to itself. Fedorov was writing, he confessed, under the influence of complete hopelessness, knowing that no one has any use for these writings, and that the teaching on the active relationship to nature, with all its consequences, will be rejected by some as a diatribe from an age of ignorance, and by others as unbelief. But he also wrote, "My certainty and boldness grow together with the negative reactions and non-recognition accorded my convictions." As Koskheniev writes, he knew that it is not the grain that appears before all others that grows longest and bears the most abundant crop. He was even convinced that a doctrine too far advanced above the general level of its time would be condemned to temporary failure, that it would have to be buried, perhaps for a long time, but that in time it was also certain to be resurrected, and that it would be recognized and accepted in the very place where once it had elicited only mockery or a smile of doubt. The only portrait that we have of Fedorov was made in stealth by the well-known painter Leonid Pasternak, father of the poet Boris Pasternak. Pasternak tells us that once, while working in the Rumyantsev Museum, he became intrigued by the appearance and manner of the old man who served in the reading room. He began to make a sketch, but noticed that the old man suspected what Pasternak was doing and obviously did not like the idea of being drawn. So for several days in a row, Pasternak sat behind a mountainous stack of books and tried to appear to be busy reading them. He would look up only infrequently, so as not to arouse the old man's suspicion. He kept his sketches, and only later learned that the old man was the philosopher Fedorov. He later used these sketches as the basis for his portrait, now in the Tolstoy Museum in Moscow, of Fedorov, Tolstoy, and Solovyev together. In it, Fedorov is an old man with a full white beard and a high bare brow. He's sitting at his desk with his hands crossed before him, and inside the large loose sleeves of his shirt. Behind him is a shelf full of books. Although he's looking in Tolstoy's direction, his eyes seem to be staring intently at something behind the portrait's frame. In the death mask, also done by Pasternak, and printed in the journal Visi, the face carries the same intense but meditative expression. Now the eyes are closed. Fedorov died in December of 1903. As Alexander Gorsky, writing under the pseudonym Ostromivov, tells us, Fedorov had been healthy in even the harshest Moscow winters of previous years, but in this particularly severe winter, friends persuaded him to wear a warm quote, instead of the light outer rag he had always worn summer and winter, and got him to start taking a cab instead of walking to work. Not long after he had begun to follow this well-meant advice, he contracted pneumonia and died. Kozevnikov, who was at Fedorov's deathbed, tells us that during the last painful hours, Fedorov said nothing of himself or of his or of his pain, or even of death itself, but continued to talk as long as he had strength about the contents of the last 2 articles he had written, and that even after he could no longer speak, his lips continued to tremble as if he were trying to express the unuttered thoughts that were still burning in his eyes. He was buried in the Skorobiashka-Chernetskil Zensky Monastery, where when Gorsky wrote in 1928, his grave could still be found, marked by a cross engraved with the words, "Christ is risen." Not many years after Gorsky's visit, the monastery was closed, the site was razed, and a playground now stands in its place. Thus concludes Section 11.6 of The Russian Cosmists by George Young. We will continue next time with Section 11.7. I will see you then. Alam.